When Barbara asked me if I could film this with you, since I missed our event in Tucson on the 29th of March, I thought, how hard could it be? Well, it turns out to be pretty hard. I'm used to speaking in front of live audiences, which means I'm accustomed to being able to see if the guy in the second row has fallen fast asleep. That means I need to up my game. If people aren't laughing, I know my jokes are falling flat. And so doing this way makes me very nervous, and as a consequence, I am holding my emotional support animal, Mary, who is a cuddly miniature dachshund. When Barbara asked me what books we should have for the book club, I suggested two: Hour of the Hunter, the first of the Walker family books, and Second Watch, Beaumont, number 21. Well, why would I suggest a book so far into a series? I'm going to tell you. Several years ago, at Thanksgiving, my son Thomas turned to me and said, "Mom, you know, J.P. Beaumont is getting to be pretty long of tooth. Have you ever thought of writing a J.P. Beaumont prequel?" I gave him sort of a glacial stare and said, "No, Tom, I have never thought about writing a Beaumont prequel." But then August came around. It was time to write the next Beaumont book, and the only idea I had was to write a prequel. First, I need to tell you about how I met J.P. Beaumont. It was 1983. I had spent 6 months trying to write a murder mystery through what turned out to be the wrong point of view. For spring break that year, I sent my 2 kids to Camp Orkila, and I sent me to Portland to spend several days with a friend of my days in the life insurance business. I got on the train at the King Street station in Seattle with a fistful of pens and an armload of Blue Line notebooks. And as the train pulled out of the King Street station, I changed the hardest thing any writer has to change. I had to change my mind. So, as the train started moving, I thought, well, what would happen if I wrote this book through the detective's point of view? And suddenly, there I was, on the backside of Magnolia Bluff, at a crime scene with J.P. Beaumont, walking around in his shoes, seeing what he was seeing through his eyes, hearing what he was hearing, but also hearing the thoughts going on in his head. And from that moment on, J.P. Beaumont and I have been author and character. That's going on 40 years now. When it comes to remembering how old characters are, that's always an issue. And so I cheated with Beau. I gave him my birthday. We were both born on October 27th, 1944. So that day, I was sitting in my writing chair in the family room. I don't use a desk, I use a laptop on my lap. I was sitting on my writing chair thinking about Beaumont. I remembered how old he was. I remembered how old I am. And then I thought about growing up in Bisbee, Arizona, where a year ahead of me, there was a guy named Doug Davis. He was smart, he was handsome, he was an outstanding athlete. In 1961, he graduated as the valedictorian of his class. He went from Bisbee High School to West Point. He went from West Point to Ranger School. He went from Ranger School to Vietnam, where a few weeks before his 23rd birthday, he died. He died in the Pleiku Highlands. I missed his funeral. I didn't know about it until after it happened. And I always felt guilty that I didn't turn up at St. Patrick's Church in Bisbee to pay my respects. But as I sat there in my writing chair that day, I thought about Doug. And I thought about Beaumont being a year younger than he was. And I thought, well, what would happen if J.P. Beaumont met up with the real Doug Davis in Vietnam? Over the years, I had become friends with a woman named Bonnie Abney, who was engaged to marry Doug at the time he died. And so I called Bonnie up, and I said, Bonnie, what would you think if I had Doug and J.P. Beaumont cross paths in the next book? She said, let me think about it. By then, Doug's mother was dead, his brother was dead, and Bonnie was really the only person left to ask. A couple of days later, she called me back and she said, Judy, I think my Douglas would be safe in your hands. And from that moment on, it was dead simple to write that book. That book came together almost magically. Beau was my age, and I haven't had dual knee replacement surgery, but that book starts with him having his dual bilateral knee replacement surgery. And in the hospital, in the recovery room, in his drug-induced dream state, who should come sauntering across his hospital room floor but Doug Davis? And Doug was still as young as he was when Beau knew him. And Beau was as old as he is now. And Doug's first comment to him was, "You got old." Writing that book was such a magical experience. The story came together almost effortlessly. And when I was done with it, I couldn't let go of it. I could not let go of it. And so I wrote an essay, which appears in the back of the book, called The Story Behind Second Watch. I sent the essay to Bonnie when I finished it. Bonnie sent it to some of Doug's West Point friends. One of them went down into his basement, found a picture he took of Doug on the 30th of July, 1966, 2 days before Doug's death. He sent a copy of that photo to Bonnie, and he sent it to me. It was a huge file. So there was this file uploading in my computer, but only gradually did it show. And what came out was the photo of Doug that you see in the afterword of Second Watch.
Two things happened.
I believe I mentioned during this first segment that I'm accustomed to working in front of live audiences, and doing this in front of a camera is pretty much outside my wheelhouse. And so I'd like to introduce my second emotional support animal. This is JoJo. She's a double dappled, long-haired miniature dachshund. 5 months ago, in December, she went out to play at 1:30. When she came back in to eat at 3:30, she was suddenly a paraplegic. She had somehow injured her back, and her hind legs didn't work. So we called our vet. He said, with this type of injury, immediate treatment, immediate surgery might work. So we went straight to an emergency vet clinic, driving hell-bent for election through rush hour traffic and rain. She underwent surgery that night. She came back home, and we were just sick. She was doped up, but her hind legs didn't work at all. And nursing a paraplegic through the dark days of December was not fun. The day in January when she finally stuck out her tail and peed on her own was a huge relief. And she has made a remarkable recovery. She can now use the doggy door, although she would rather I opened the door and let her in and out. And day before yesterday, I actually saw her sitting and scratching her ear with one of those weak hind legs. So she's not only my emotional support dog, she's also our little miracle dog. And how long she'll be willing to sit here quietly is another issue entirely. We talked about Second Watch. Second Watch is Beaumont number 21, but now we're going to talk about Hour of the Hunter, sort of. Hour of the Hunter was my first hardback. It's also the first Walker family book, but it's also a book that is most closely connected to my own biography. So first I'm going to tell you a little about me. I wanted to be a writer from the time I was in second grade at Greenway School in Bisbee, Arizona. I grew up. I won a scholarship to the University of Arizona. I signed up to be an English major because I knew I wanted to be a writer. All through college, I worked as a secretary in the English department 15 hours a week. And between my sophomore and junior year, I was putting up mail when the creative writing professor came in, and I said, I'd like to enroll in your class this fall. And he looked at me and he said, you're a girl. And I said, so? He said, girls become teachers or nurses, boys become writers. And he didn't let me into his class. So I became a teacher. I taught English in Tucson for 2 years. Then, when I didn't like that very much, I became a school librarian on the Tohono O'odham Reservation for 5 years. And then I spent 10 years in the life insurance business. I married a guy who was allowed in the creative writing class that was closed to me. He imitated Faulkner and Hemingway primarily by drinking too much and writing too little. He told me in 1968, shortly after we married, there's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it. So other than writing poetry under the dark of night, when he was passed out cold in his recliner, I didn't do anything about my own writing until over a decade later. While we taught on the reservation, he taught English and Spanish. I was the librarian. That was at Sells on the reservation. Sells is 60 miles west of Tucson. We lived near 3 Points. 3 Points is a trading post 30 miles west of Tucson. And our house was 7 miles beyond the trading post, 2 miles off the highway, 7 miles to the nearest neighbor and or telephone. We lived on a little volcanic knoll that we called the Hill. On the 22nd of May of 1970, we went to school on Friday morning. School was at Sells, 30 miles in the other direction. We got to school, and it was prom weekend that weekend, and I was the junior class sponsor. We were expecting out-of-town company at our house on Friday evening, and so the kids and I had talked it over, and we had decided that we would decorate the gym for the prom on Saturday morning. But when I got to school that day, the high school principal, a retired Army colonel, said, "You will decorate after school today." So my husband and I talked it over at lunch, and he said, "Okay, when school gets out, I'll hitchhike home and walk up to the house. That way I'll be there to let the company in when they get there. When you finish decorating, you come home in the car, and then we'll all go into town to Tucson for dinner." So that was the plan, and that's what I did. As I was leaving school that day, I looked over at the parking lot and Law and Order, and there were a lot of vehicles parked there, unusual vehicles parked there. But I counted the highway patrol cars, and I knew that driving home over the speed limit that day, I was absolutely golden. Got to the house, picked up my husband, picked up the company. We headed into Tucson, and halfway between our turnoff and the trading post, we were stopped at a roadblock. And we said, "What's going on?" And the deputy said, "There's been a homicide on the reservation." We said, "Anglo or Indian?" They said, "Anglo." We said, "Good, nobody we know then." We went on to the trading post. My husband went in, pumped the gas, and I went inside to pay for it. While I was at the counter, I overheard a deputy talking to the clerk, Shirley, and I heard her say something about a man in a green car and something about two little kids. When I got back out to the car and we started into town, I mentioned that. And a couple of miles down the road, my husband said, "A guy in a green car, I wonder if that's the man who gave me a ride home today." So we went back to the trading post. We told the deputy who we were, where we lived, and that we didn't have a phone. The next morning, at 6 o'clock in the morning, Jack Lyons, who was Pima County's chief homicide detective at the time, showed up on our doorstep. He told us that the previous afternoon, 10 miles west of Sal's, so 40 miles from our house, some miners coming home from the Hecla mine near Casa Grande saw these two little Anglo kids, a boy and a girl, walking along the highway, 70 miles from nowhere. So they stopped and they asked the little boy who was 4, "What are you doing?" And he said, "We're walking on the beach." And the Indian said, "Where's your mommy?" And he said, "She's over there, she's dead." So the Indians went where he pointed. They found a woman who had been forced off the highway at gunpoint, shot, raped in front of her children. Oops, it's treat time. I just lost my emotional support animal. Sorry. And left. They found her where the little boy said, and she wasn't dead, but she died before they could get her to the hospital. That happened about 20 minutes after 2. An hour later, the man who killed her stopped, picked up my husband who was hitchhiking, and gave him a ride to our house. Not just to our turnoff, but up the 2-mile dirt road in addition. And on the way up to our house, he asked my husband, "You leave your wife out here by herself much?" And my husband said, "Well, she's got the dogs." He had no idea he was talking to a killer, and he certainly had no idea that he was speaking to a serial killer. Jack Lyons interviewed my husband from 6 o'clock in the morning that day until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He drew out all kinds of telling details about things my husband saw in the car during that drive home. And those were details he was able to use to identify the perpetrator later. The interview was on Saturday, morning and afternoon. We went to the prom that evening. On Sunday, we went into town, and my husband was able to sort through that he had been given a ride home in a green Maverick. On Monday, we went back to town, and he did a composite drawing. And as soon as the little boy saw the composite, he said, "That's the man who killed my mommy." Within a matter of days, Jack Lyons had identified who the killer was using the details my husband had provided. But he didn't go right out and arrest him, because as he was working the case, he realized that he was dealing with a serial killer, a guy who killed people at 20 minutes after 2 on the 22nd day of the month. While we were teaching at Sells, I was on a 12-month contract, so I worked all summer. My husband worked construction all summer, and believe me, there wasn't much construction around 3 Points. So for many of the next 2 months, I was there on the hill by myself for about 45 of them. I wore a loaded weapon. I was fully prepared to use it, and I did use it one day. I fired all 6 shots at a rapidly retreating rattlesnake who was still laughing when he went up over the wall and disappeared. We had a rope pull pump on the well, and I was able to get the pump started. And oh, by the way, rattlesnakes are sort of hard to hit, but I figured if the killer showed up, he would present a larger target, and I was motivated. If you can defend yourself in the face of a very real danger, if you can get your own water in the desert, you gain a measure of independence that no amount of bra burning can ever duplicate. By the way, I did burn a bra once. It was a nursing bra that I tossed on a barbecue grill after I finished cooking dinner, so it was sort of a mixed message, and it was also a big fail because instead of lighting up in a flame like I wanted to, the rubber inside it just sort of smoldered and shriveled away. Jack Lyons was concerned that the incidents were getting closer together, and so on the 20th of July, he took my husband to San Manuel, where my husband identified the killer as he came off shift. My husband rode in the police vehicle into town with the killer in the back seat. And on the way into town, he admitted having been to our house on 3 different occasions in the intervening 60 days. We had been scheduled to be July 22nd. My husband was a bit of a pill, by the way. My first husband, the rat, and over the course of the next many years, between 1970 and 1982, he was hospitalized 9 times for chronic alcoholism. I finally divorced him in 1980 when he turned up at my 6-year-old son's t-ball game so drunk that when the game was over, he crawled on his hands and knees from the bleachers back to the car. And it was then that I finally realized if 18 years of loving him hadn't fixed him, I needed to do something to save my children and save myself. So I got a divorce. And then, because I knew I was in danger of taking him back, I decided I needed to get out of Dodge. So the kids and I did an adventure in moving and came to Seattle. I was emotionally broken. I had overspent my strength by probably 10 years. And I was having a really hard time figuring out how to pick up the pieces and move on. When my insurance company offered to pay for me to take the Dale Carnegie course, I thought, a class in winning friends and influencing people, what a good idea. But I got to the first class, discovered it was a course in public speaking, and I didn't want to take that, but the only way to get my money back was to take the whole class, so I did. And in Dale Carnegie, you're required to do a series of talks. Every participant does a series of talks. And one of them was supposed to be about something that changed the course of your life. I thought, well, whatever happened to me? And then I remembered the 22nd of May of 1970. And so when it came time for me to do my talk, I told that story. Because after that event, my husband used to say, well, you changed. And I always told him I didn't. But the truth is I did change because I had become a different person. So I gave the talk that night. And after the talk was over, during the coffee break time, one of my classmates, Carol Erickson, came up and said, you know, somebody should write a book about that. And I thought, well, I'm divorced. What have I got to lose? And so that was Thursday night. I thought about it all day Friday, all day Saturday. And about midnight Sunday night, I thought, who wants to read a book where you have this life-changing experience and a decade later you get a divorce? How about if I write a novel? So Sunday afternoon, after church, I picked up pen and paper and I began writing my first novel, a book called By Reason of Insanity. Don't write this down. Don't go out looking for it, because that book was never published. I started writing it in the middle of March. It was a thinly fictionalized version of that very real story. I did knock my husband off in the course of writing that book. That was the fiction part. Gave him a wonderful funeral in the high school gym. And I actually reached the end of what turned out to be a 1,200-page long manuscript the evening of the 22nd of May of that year. I was on fire. I wrote from 4 o'clock to 7 o'clock every morning before I got the kids up to go to school. I wrote in the evenings after they went to bed. I wrote on weekends. That book was never published. When I finished writing it by hand, I had someone type it. I wasn't a good typist then. I'm a much better typist now, 7 million words later. But I took the manuscript for By Reason of Insanity to a lady in Seattle who taught writing, paid her $200 to evaluate the manuscript. She referred me to both an editor and an agent. The editor returned the book by return mail. And the agent, I met her. I showed up in her office with a box containing my manuscript. And she took one look at it and she said, "This is your first book?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "It's too long, cut it in half." So I did. Then I took it back to her and she tried to sell it. The editors who turned it down said the stuff that was fiction was fine and the stuff that was real was unbelievable and would never happen. So finally, the agent suggested that I write something that was entirely fiction. And so I wrote the first Detective Beaumont book, which was bought by the second editor who saw it. By the way, some beginning writers, if they get an agent for their first manuscript, if the agent can't sell that first manuscript, they keep the manuscript and fire the agent. I did the opposite. I fired the manuscript and kept the agent. And that agent is still my agent all these books and all these decades later. Break. That's just a natural breaking place in this.
We're ready when you are.
And so, abandoned by all trusty emotional support animals, here goes segment number 3. While Bill was off checking our previous segments, I was scanning the news, and I saw an article about a news broadcaster doing a selfie haircut on TV in Sacramento, accidentally captured her husband showering in the nude behind her. Fortunately, Bill is behind the camera, not in front of it.
I'm fully dressed.
So you may be wondering, what does, by reason of insanity, a never published article have to do with me? Well, it was the place where I gave myself permission to start writing. I wrote 9 Beaumont books, and when I threatened to knock him off, my editor said, "Oh, no, don't do that. Do you remember that first book you wrote, the one that was never published?" Well, I did remember that book. He said, "How about if you rework that one and we'll turn that into your first hardback," which turns out to be Hour of the Hunter. I signed a contract to write that book. They gave me a paycheck to write that book. They gave me a deadline to write that book. And that was all very good. The problem was the killer from the 22nd of May of 1970 was then and still is in prison in Arizona. And although my husband, the witness, by the way, he pled guilty to the murder on the reservation. The other 2 murders are still pending, and he got life without parole. The other 2 cases are still pending in case he is ever released. My husband was the witness, and I didn't want to write a book that would call his attention to me. So, although I had a paycheck and a deadline and a contract, I had no idea what I was going to write because I didn't have a bad guy. And then, when I was deep in a case of writer's block, I was saved by my University of Arizona Alumni magazine. There at the back of the magazine, right before the obituaries, was this little boxed article that said, "The newly reconstituted creative writing program at the University of Arizona was just going swimmingly." And I turned to my husband and I said, I graduated from there. I have all of these books out. Maybe the U of A would like me to come and be writer in residence for a semester in the sun. He said, "Call him up, ask him." I sold life insurance for 10 years. I'm not afraid of making a cold call. So I did just that. I called up and I told the guy who I was, the director who I was, and what I did, that I graduated from there, and wouldn't he like me to come be writer in residence? And he said, and this is a direct quote, "Oh, we don't do anything with genre fiction here. We only do literary fiction." Well, let me tell you, It was a miracle. I was healed of writer's block on the spot, and the crazed killer in Hour of the Hunter turned out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. That was my first case of real writerly revenge, and it was fun making Andrew Philip Carlyle be as bad as he was. When I finished writing Hour of the Hunter and went back to Beaumont, it was fun again. And then my editor suggested I write something else, and I wrote the first Joanna Brady book. And when I was tired of all of my characters, then I wrote the first Allie Reynolds book. But if I hadn't taken that break from Beaumont to write Hour of the Hunter, Beaumont wouldn't have made it back book number 10, to say nothing of book number 24. I spent 5 years on the Tohono O'odham Reservation. I told 26 stories a week in K through 6 classrooms, and many of the stories and stories I told in those classrooms were the stories and legends of the Tohono O'odham people. My goal in writing Hour of the Hunter was to introduce those people who I came to really admire and value while I was on the reservation. I wanted to make those people come alive for people who would never set foot on the reservation. And so when I began writing my story, the story in Hour of the Hunter, with a fictional killer, I began dropping some of those stories and legends into the middle of my story. And I was astonished at how easily they became entwined with the one I was writing. Hour of the Hunter was my first experience in writing something that wasn't first person. The story is told through 7 or 8 different points of view, with an elastic timeline that goes back and forth over 70 years. And after writing 9 books in first person with that particular kind of discipline that's required, writing Hour of the Hunter was like going on vacation. When I wrote my story and the other Walker family books, I really tried to honor the traditions and beliefs of the people I met there. But for whatever reason, I didn't go back to visit until 40 years after I left the reservation, when the director of the Tribal Museum in Tapawa asked me if I would come there and do a signing of the 4th Walker family book, Queen of the Night. So I said yes, because the tradition on the reservation is that yes is always better than no. But the idea of going back to the reservation made me very nervous, because I thought I had treated them in an honorable fashion, but I didn't know how the desert people felt about what I had written. The signing was scheduled for a blustery Saturday in March. And so we drove from Tucson 70 miles out to Tapawa. And when we got there, we pulled into the parking lot, and it was full of cars with out-of-state licenses, cars from Illinois and Michigan and Wisconsin and Idaho. Because it turned out people who had looked at my schedule on the website had packed up their cars and driven 140 miles round trip to see what it was all about. When it was time to start the program, the MC introduced the medicine man who gave the invocation. I know he was talking about me part of the time because every once in a while he said the word library or librarian. Evidently, there is no word in Tohono O'odham for librarian. When the invocation was over, the MC said that a group of young people would come out and do a circle dance. And so he said, while they're dancing, this is a sacred dance, and while they're dancing, please don't take any photos. But when we open it for social dancing, you're welcome to join the circle. The summer after my daughter was born, we were invited to the wine dance. The wine dance happens in the summer. The wine is made from the fruit from the top of the saguaros. The women and kids go out into the saguaros and use dead ribs from saguaros to knock the fruit down from the tree, and then they take it back in baskets. They boil it, they mash it, they ferment it, and it turns into a liquor that has the consistency and look of tomato juice and the kick of tequila. And at the wine festival, you sit around in a circle around a fire. It's in the summer, but once the sun goes down, the desert turns very cold. And yes, in the dead of summer, you need a fire to sit around. At the wine dance, you sit in a circle, and they pass a cup of the wine around and around the circle, and everybody drinks from the cup until the people in the circle are all so drunk that they barf into the dirt. Now, the Milgon, the Anglo reaction is, ew. But in actual fact, it is a very sacred idea. It's completing the circle. It's taking the fruit from the top of the saguaro and returning it to the earth. We were invited to the wine dance. We had a 6-month-old baby. My husband went to the wine dance. I stayed home. And from then until the day he died, he always rubbed my nose in the fact that he got to sit in the circle, and I did not. And so, on that blustery Saturday morning, as I was watching those young people doing the sacred dance, I thought, well, you know, Judy, you've griped about this for the last 40 years. How about if you put your money where your mouth is? And so, when the MC opened it up for social dancing, I stood up to go down and join the circle. And do you know what happened? The people there gave me a standing ovation. I went down. When I just told you that story, I can still feel the goosebumps rising on my legs because it was a profound event for me. And then the next miracle happened because all of the ladies from all those Milgon vehicles from all over from snowbirds all over the country, they came down and danced in the circle with me. I truly did make the people on the reservation come alive for all those readers. People who come to my events are often surprised when they end up getting a poetry reading in addition to discussions of my murder mysteries. But guess what? You're not going to be excused either. I grew up in Bisbee, Arizona, and it took years for the tentacles of TV broadcasting to make it over the Mule Mountains and down into the canyons where Bisbee is built. And so when I was growing up on those long summer evenings before TV came along, my father read to us out of the treasury of the familiar. The wreck of the Hesperus, the song of the shirt, Horatius at the bridge, the blind man and the elephant. I loved the cadence of poetry. I loved how it was the language of the heart. And so when I was living out on the hill, and my first husband was passed out cold in his recliner, I wasn't supposed to be writing, but it turns out writers still write. And so it's not surprising that I turned my hand to writing poetry. I jotted off little pieces of what I thought were art and hid them away in the strongbox, a place where I knew he would never see them. Looking back on that poetry years later, it was astonishing to see that even as early as 1970, barely 2 years after I married my husband, I was already glimpsing cracks in the foundation of our marriage and wondering if it would hold, and of course, eventually it didn't. I mentioned in an earlier segment that my husband had difficulties. He told me during one of his courses of treatment that he knew he was an alcoholic by the time he was 15. It would have been nice if he had told me, because I had no idea what I was up against. I divorced him in 1980 after holding my finger in the dike for years. He went into treatment 9 times in the 8 years before we got a divorce, between 1972 and 1980. He went into treatment because I insisted on it, not because he thought it was necessary. When my daughter was born, he dropped me off at the hospital in Tucson, and I had the baby. I named the baby. 3 days later, he came back to pick us up, and he was drunk. And suddenly I had to make a terrible decision. If he was drunk, did I hold the baby and have him drive home to the hill, or did he hold the baby and I drive home? Ultimately, I drove myself home from the hospital. But by the time we got there, I was pretty upset. And I said, you know, you always told me that when we had kids, you would stop drinking, and we had kids. Here's the baby. So he went into the house and into the kitchen and opened his bottles of booze and poured them all down the kitchen sink. I had no idea that the whole time I was in the hospital, he had been off on a bender. And I had no idea how dangerous it could be for someone like that to go off booze cold turkey. So for the next 5 days, I was alone on the hill with a newborn baby, no telephone, 30 miles from town, with a husband who was going through DTs. And I thought, I can do this. He's keeping his promise. I can help him do that. 3 weeks later, some of his drinking friends showed up in the yard. They popped a lid off a can of Coors, handed it over to him, and we were off and running again. And that cycle continued until I divorced him in 1980. I also said I had to leave town. I didn't divorce him because I suddenly stopped loving him. I divorced him because I knew I was still susceptible. I divorced him because I had to save myself. And then I knew if I stayed in town, I was susceptible, and if he asked me to, I would take him back. So that's when the kids and I did our adventure in moving, driving my 78 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme with a U-Haul trailer holding all of our worldly goods behind it from Phoenix, Arizona to Seattle. And months after arriving, I embarked on my new life of writing. I was living in Seattle in May of 1982. He was living in Tempe, Arizona, in a house that had belonged to his grandmother. His grandmother had passed away, and his mother owned it, and my former husband's mother owned it then. He lived there rent-free. She paid the utilities. In May, he broke a wrist in an on-the-job accident and was off work. Because it was on the job, it was covered by workman's comp. So he had money coming in. He didn't have to pay anything but food and booze, and it was mostly booze. He drank steadily from May until just before Thanksgiving. And just before Thanksgiving, his mother, Mary Grandma, my first mother-in-law, called and said, "Hey, guess what? I just scored a last-minute ticket from Vegas to Phoenix, and I'm coming down so we can have Thanksgiving together." In honor of her coming down, he decided that he would sober up. And without giving any thought to how much he had been drinking or for how long, he went off booze cold turkey. They had Thanksgiving dinner together. Then, about midnight that night, a Tempe police officer found him lying in the middle of the street. At first, they thought he was the victim of a hit and run, but when they got him to Scottsdale Memorial Hospital, they discovered that he had gone into DTs. He was hospitalized with no kidney or liver function. Mary Grandma was there. She had only a 7th grade education, so she was at the hospital at her son's side, but she couldn't get them to give her a straight answer about what his condition was. So she finally called me up and asked me if I would speak to the doctors. And so I did. And this is what happened. He's dying. Words come through the wire and hammer home, despite the doctor's cloying, unctuous tone. He's dying. I thought my tears exhausted years ago, but yet it hurts. Oh God, how much it hurts. He's dying. This is what I wanted when I thought a widow's garb would suit me better than a court's decree. He's dying. Should I go to him or stay away? What right have I to be there now? He's dying. I'll go. And I did go. I flew down on Christmas Day. I spent the next several days at the hospital with him and with his mother. On New Year's Eve, I took her out for an early dinner, the Blue Plate special, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We were back at the hospital by 7, and this is what happened. We keep a vigil by his midnight bed, his mother and his former wife grieving for the man we loved and lost. It's harder for his mother than for me. I've already known the sting of loss. She's only now begun to see she cannot win. He's quiet now. A nurse comes in to loosen his restraints. not looking at the women waiting there. She knows. She doesn't want to say. The hours creep by. All stories are expended, yet we need some sound to hold the night at bay. Please sing, his mother asks me, and I do. It is a serenade of love, of songs we knew and treasured through the years, from bawdy barroom ditties to sweet hymns. The hours flow by. We hold his hands. I sing a song. I sing a line and wait to see if he will breathe again. He doesn't. It's over. Amen. In March of 1983, it was time for me to get out all of the documents you must present when someone dies. The marriage certificate, the birth certificates, the divorce decree. And in the strong box, with all of those documents, I found the pieces of paper I had jotted poems on over the years. And when I read back through them, when I thought I was writing art back when I started, what I was really doing was using words to deal with the central issues of my life. That poetry is now in a collection called After the Fire, and the title poem goes like this. I have touched the fire. It burned me, but I knew I lived. It seared me, but it made me whole. He called me. I went gladly, though I saw the rocks, fell laughing through the singeing air. I have known the fire. I'll live with nothing rather than with less. The flame is out. There's nothing left but ash. That book of poetry, After the Fire, is still in print. This is an earlier edition. The latest edition has this lovely pink lavender cover on it, filled with fireweed. And fireweed only blooms after a fire. My husband, my first husband, may not have been worth much as husband material, but for someone who was a mystery writer and a poet, that man was a gold mine.